Hey everyone, Joshua Gibson here with episode 74 of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. Before we get started, I'd like to give a quick shout out to the show's sponsors, BarShield and First Attempt Lifting. BarShield created a maintenance kit designed to prevent rust and restore spin to a barbell's sleeves. My discount code, PWPodcast, gets you 10% off of your entire purchase, and it will also help me to continue producing great podcasts. Head over to barshieldUSA.com, pick up a kit, and get your bars looking and spinning like new. I've also recently partnered with Matt Bergeron of First Attempt Lifting to give you guys 10% off of any diet or digital coaching service. Matt's approach mirrors mine in that it focuses on principles instead of methods. Don't believe me? Go check it out at firstattemptlifting.com. Help support the show and support your own goals. Use the code PWPodcast_diet for any nutrition service or PWPodcast_lift for any online programming option. That's it for the long-winded intro. Let's get on to this week's podcast with Michael Ray. And we are live. I am back again for episode 74 of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. And I'm joined today by Michael Ray, owner of Shenandoah Valley Performance Clinic, doctor of Chiropractic, Barbell Medicine staff. I'm not sure what credentials I'm leaving out, and you can kind of fill us in, but how are you doing, Michael?
I'm doing well, Josh. How are you?
Doing pretty well. I usually stumble once in the intro, so I've kind of become accustomed to that, so it doesn't faze me anymore. But
yeah, you actually did pretty well with the Shenandoah part. People usually trip up over that name.
Yeah, I think I've listened to the Clinical Athlete podcast with you on there so many times that it's just second nature to kind of say that. So yeah, as far as credentials go, did I leave anything that you feel is relevant to the audience?
Man. Yeah, that's an interesting start into it. I have issues with titles and credentials, but not really. No, I have a master's in exercise science, but I'm not big on that kind of stuff, so it's irrelevant, really.
Well, and then I shouldn't leave out the most important part. You're also a practitioner, right? So you're in the gym, you coach and you help people improve performance, which I think is equally as important as the other titles listed before. So the overarching theme of this show, the kind of the core question, I guess, what should all strength athletes know about pain, right? And there's so much to unpack. It sounds very simple, but kind of digging right in, I guess we would try and figure out what pain actually is and what it actually means to experience pain. So maybe you can kind of give us some insights into our current notion of pain and our understanding of what it is and how that's kind of communicated within a system or within the human body.
Yeah, that's a hell of a question to start with. It's really like, how much time do your listeners have? Because we probably could talk about this for a couple of weeks and we would still be farther into the topic than when we started. The discussion is pretty difficult to have. And the reason is when you have these discussions, the first thing you have to do is define your terms, right? And so we're like, well, how do we define pain? And this is something we've been attempting to answer probably since we had consciousness as human beings. And we were like, what is this experience we're having in our reality? But probably the easiest place to start at this point would be in 1979, the International Association for the Study of Pain was developed. And once they were developed, there was this agreement that there was a need for taxonomy on the discussion of pain and the variables thereof that are associated with it. And so they got together and they published it. I believe it is actually just called the Taxonomy of Pain. And they defined the term, which was kind of the first time in the healthcare industry where we were like, we now have a collective term to utilize and discuss this experience people are having. And people can kind of go look that up and read it. It's nothing crazy. It's just kind of like this subjective experience that may or may not have to do with anything with tissue damage, which was kind of the big first push where we were like, wait a second, we've been in this biomedical model for who knows how long, pretty much since we started trying to treat this idea of pain. And the biomedical model was basically pain equals tissue damage or underlying pathology. There's this one-to-one correlation. It was a very dualistic approach, so mind versus body, one or the other, not the two intertwined. And so this was the first point where we were like, well, it is part of the picture. Biology and tissue structure has a correlation, but we also need to consider things like psychology and sociology of the person. And so that was kind of the start of everything, of this big shift over to the biopsychosocial model. And the biopsychosocial model got introduced in 1977 by a psychologist named Engel. So he was kind of already out there first, and then this kind of happened. And then since then, we've been trying to modify that definition to be more appropriate for basically daily vernacular and usage, because a lot of times with these definitions, they're written in a level where it's like, to the person who's experiencing it, this doesn't mean fucking anything to me. You read that and you're like, I have no idea what this shit's saying. All I can tell you is I'm in pain. Like, you know, and that kind of gets to the root of the issue, because it's this very individualistic experience. And what I tend to tell people, especially in practice, is I will never know what your pain is. I can be empathetic to it, but I'll never be you. I'll never experience it. So all I can do is try to be your advocate, listen to your experience, and then help guide the path to where you want to get to be. I think if I were to give a single definition at this point that I like the most, because there's been several since the 1979 definition, would probably be Cohen et al. And they just came out this year with the definition. And to me, that seems to be the most all-encompassing as far as the variables we've discussed previously with it. I like it the best.
Yeah, and out of curiosity, before the IASP kind of introduced their definition of pain, what understanding were we functioning from? And again, I'm kind of referencing this article you wrote. It's on the Logic of Rehab website, and the listeners can go check it out and see all these terms and the definitions kind of written out there. But what understanding were we functioning from? Because you kind of referenced it there, right? We thought it was like this one-to-one tissue damage experience of pain. Has that always been the case before that point?
Yeah, pretty much before Engel's work, where we were like, wait a second, it can't be this simple. Like, we were very much in a reductionist mindset. If someone was experiencing pain, then that means there's something wrong with that person from a tissue standpoint. I should be able to find the pathology, treat the pathology, and ipso facto get rid of the pain. And that was for, thousands of years. That's kind of been our approach, that something is underlying and wrong with the person that we need to fix to get them out of pain. And this was the first kind of tipping point where we started questioning that a little bit more. The unfortunate reality is, not to be too negative, but clinicians tend to not read research. And so the majority of clinicians, I'm willing to bet, that you would go see today would still be functioning on the biomedical model of, if you're presenting with pain, then there's a problem that needs fixing, that has nothing to do with you as a human being that's experiencing pain, but everything to do with what's wrong with your body.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I read a book. He was kind of recounting this experience. I think his name's Harry Beecher. He was working with soldiers, and the soldiers would come in. They'd have some sort of like gunshot wound, and they wouldn't have this experience of pain until they were taken off the field of battle. I guess just everything that was going on kind of took up their attention to the point of neglecting the tissue damage. So I think right there, and then on the other side, we can see the experience of pain without tissue damage, just kind of the perception of eventual damage. So I guess going from there, it becomes really fuzzy, right? So we have a lack of the experience of pain with tissue damage, and the opposite of that as well. So how do you deal with this in practice? I mean, if someone comes to you and they say like, hey, I'm in pain, and there's nothing that is objectively wrong with them, what's a conversation like that look like?
Yeah, it gets interesting, mostly because, and this would be like a whole nother series of podcasting in and of itself, but the social and cultural influences of pain perception. And so societally speaking, that can influence what our thoughts are about pain and our beliefs about pain and tradition about how to handle pain. And so you have to take into consideration the person and the environment they've been in growing up and what society thinks of that. And then trying to kind of peel back the layers of, well, this is our understanding of pain currently. So I think if I were to reduce it down as much as I could, pain is threat perception. And that's what I try to get across to people. Whether you've experienced acute trauma and you perceive pain out of it, or you're having persistent pain that's far removed from any traumas, it is still a threat perception-based system, which means we've biologically adapted to that system to survive as a species. It makes sense. So if I perceive threat, there's a good possibility, whether it is or isn't associated with the technical term is nociception, which would be tissue damage, then there's a good probability I could experience pain and have perception of pain. And so I try to educate them. That's the first step, is hearing their experience of the situation. What have they been told about pain? What are their beliefs about pain? And then how do I need to reframe that based on what we currently see in the research evidence, but doing it in a manner where it's not overly challenging? Because one of the biggest issues is if I'm trying to change your beliefs about something, A, you probably need to like me as your clinician. We need to have some type of bond and trust with one another, which is very similar to like a coach and an athlete. And then B, time. And so once we have time to build trust, then I can really start challenging beliefs. But if I try to rush that process, and many times I fuck it up and it doesn't go well, and you end up losing a patient and you're not able to help them, unfortunately.
Do you find that it's difficult to balance the amount of input that people get from other sources of information? So, I mean, if you just scroll on your like Instagram feed, for example, there are all these videos of people saying, hey, are you experiencing this type of pain, this type of discomfort? Here's your problem. Here's a diagnosis, without any understanding of what the individual is doing, their training, their past injuries, etc. And then you're here with them in person trying to educate them, but then they go out and they're exposed to all of those other influences. I mean, how can you kind of balance that ability to inform them and kind of make them immune to, I guess, Google or Instagram or sources like that?
Well, the joke used to be like, don't WebMD yourself, right? Or don't go to Google too much. And now it's pretty much like, stay away from Instagram and Facebook. But the easier thing is, like, since I've joined with Barbell Medicine, we talk about this a lot, but inoculating people. And so basically, if I can educate you to the point that you are confident in your belief system as it relates to pain and pain perception and how to handle it, then I've inoculated you against that. And then hopefully you can go inoculate other people. I mean, it really is almost like vaccinating against stupid bullshit that we tend to see on the internet. But it's tough. Like, you have to build a bond first. It is really difficult. Like Derek Miles, who co-runs the Logic Rehab with me and has also joined Barbell Medicine, we've talked about this a lot, but it's really hard to change your enemy's belief system, right? If your enemy came up to you and was like, yeah, I know you think this, but you're wrong, and here's why, you'd be like, whatever, man, fuck you. Like, you wouldn't want to listen to them, right? And so you've got to get that trust first and then try to educate them about it. The probably overarching theme is, and not to get too like political here or economical, is we live in a capitalist society. And so one of the biggest things hinge upon this is that we have to deliver services or goods in order to profit and survive. Well, with that comes the advent of capitalist endeavors for profit in the medical world and healthcare. That's just the way it is. It's much easier for me to tell you what problems you have and why you're experiencing pain and sell you a solution than trying to alter your belief system about what you think pain is and how you can better handle it. It's also less advantageous as a business endeavor for me to empower you, give you self-efficacy, and have confidence to manage yourself. Now, I very much like to think altruistically that most people are out to help others. I don't think we're out there just trying to price gouge each other and steal from people. But I also think that it is a part of the equation we have to discuss because we live in a capitalist society.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, I guess they aren't necessarily aware to the fact that, so say you have that interaction with your enemy, right? And you guys are name calling and disagreeing, and no one comes away with differing beliefs, but the people that are observing that conversation, right? So if you start calling your enemy an idiot, right, and you're saying, hey, here's the evidence, here's why you're wrong, I don't think they would change their views, but maybe the surrounding group of people would be more likely to reconsider what they believe. So I think it is important to have those conversations, even if side A and side B are immune. Maybe the other participants can kind of take something away, and I think that's really important. So kind of going along with that, what are some common myths and misconceptions about pain that you maybe come into contact with on a day-to-day basis?
The first would be what we've already touched on as far as pain equals tissue damage. That's probably the biggest misconception we have in society. I regularly make the joke, if you've ever watched Men in Black, if I could have one of those, it's called like the neurostimulator or something, or neuroneutralizer. If I could have that and just like flash the world and then step in and be like, hey, I know you used to believe this about pain, but this is what pain is so far. And then just step away. I think we could just totally eradicate this issue altogether. But, and you mentioned that earlier, like part of this issue is us as clinicians don't really understand it very well. And then we're trying to educate people about it most of the time, not to the what we currently know about research evidence. So that in and of itself is a difficult task. But that would be the biggest misconception I think people have, is that pain equals tissue damage. And until we can kind of re-educate people and get them to realize that that's not what it equals threat perception, we got a long road ahead of us. And it's going to be really difficult to shift this paradigm by ourselves. But I do think, like you said, that's why public discourse is important, because it gives us an opportunity to kind of hash things out. And I often think of that when I regularly find myself in like social media discussions. And one of the things I think about is this public discourse is going to be observed by a lot of different people. So the hope is someone can take something away from this that's changed beliefs. I think the second thing would be that people think if they experience pain, then whatever is associated with the experiencing of pain, they should avoid it. And so we call that the fear avoidance behavior model of Lay-In, which is kind of the person that coined that. And so that's an issue, because what we're realizing is if you continue to avoid it, it perpetuates this vicious cycle of fear avoidance behavior. And then oftentimes, and this can get way down the rabbit hole of predictive processing and kind of subjective realities and machine learning and stuff. But basically, if you expect the outcome to be pain perception and you've attached that correlation to, say, a movement, then there's a high probability, if that's your expectation going into the situation, that's probably what you're going to get out of it. So then you avoid it. And then anytime you end up having to do it unwillfully, then you're most likely going to get symptoms out of it. So I think that would be the other big kind of fallacy with dealing with pain, is that people think they should avoid anything that kind of causes it.
Yeah, this is a really tough topic to kind of give out some practical recommendations, because each situation is so unique that it kind of takes a deeper understanding to start applying some of these concepts. But if somebody is experiencing pain, if we're looking on a scale, say 1 to 10, at what point is it necessary to seek treatment or seek out someone such as yourself to kind of adjust the variables that are influencing that pain? When is it okay? I guess this would kind of go along with like the different types of pain. So if we're experiencing something that's chronic, something that's acute, and then how, I guess that pain is experienced over time, right? Does it get worse?
Yeah.
Is it kind of just maintained? Is it recurrent? Does it just kind of go and come back? That's a big question, and however you want to approach that, feel free. But I think that this would be really insightful.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It could go a lot of different directions. So when to seek consultation, I would say, let's start with like different types of pain. So the way I look at this is that pain is all under the umbrella of pain. You subjectively may experience it differently than someone else and use different descriptors. And this in and of itself gets at the difficulty of having this conversation, is we are limited by our linguistic abilities, meaning the language we utilize probably doesn't accurately portray our experience, right? No matter how hard we try. And then you have to couple that with me being the outside observer of your experience. So we would call this, I think it's called like a priori, meaning like you're experiencing this kind of event, and I will never be there. I will never be able to be in that box with you and experience that situation. And so that means that I'm trying to understand it as an outside observer through language and you communicating with me. And this can get quite complicated, and our language tends to fall short, and we're not great communicators about it. So that would be a big issue that we have to kind of deal with and get over. But with that said, all pain is just this umbrella term. It is this negative, subjective experience that I have to try as the clinician to understand what you're experiencing. we use different descriptors all the time, but we're, different subjective ideas. Is it stabbing? Is it a dull ache? Does it feel deep? Is it burning? Those things are just your subjective experience, and we're trying to objectively measure what you're experiencing. And that's a really, really difficult task, and it isn't very useful in a lot of scenarios, unfortunately. So that would be the first thing I would say to start with, is I don't like, even though I write about it as well, the research literature has dichotomized out the topic of pain. We've said there's acute pain and there's chronic pain. And I think this is a major flaw that eventually is going to come to head in the research world that we're going to have to sort through. But the idea is acute pain is pain that's less than, I think the official definition is less than 6 weeks. And then you have subacute, which is like 6 to 12 weeks. And then after 12 weeks, we're like, well, it's chronic. I guess like 12 weeks in one day at the stroke of midnight, you've shifted from acute to chronic. And this is how ludicrous this is. And we really don't have supportive research to say we should be dichotomizing this out. Are there things that happen from a nervous system perspective with persistent pain that's different than acute? Most likely. That's altering our responses to it, causes things like allodynia, which is you experience pain with non-painful stimuli, or hyperalgesia, which is an increased pain response to like nociception and stuff. But overall, it's just this umbrella term of pain. Now, with acute, it means you experienced a trauma and you got pain out of it. Can you experience traumas and not perceive pain? Absolutely. You mentioned the soldier example earlier, and that's a great example. One of the big discussions on pain is, and one of the ways to treat it is a goal-directed somatic experience. So what does that mean? Goal-directed means that the point of it is to draw our attention to it. So we pay attention to it and we're aware of the situation. Somatic would mean body. So our attention is drawn to an area of our body because the system's predicated on threat perception. So if that's where everything begins, it starts this cascade of this experience, I need to have my attention drawn to that area, hopefully so I can protect it and I don't incur damage, and then I can live on as a species and survive without issue, right? If I'm experiencing pain perception, and let's say that's coupled with nociception, which would be from tissue damage to the area, if I'm a soldier in battle, I can override the nociception because it's goal-directed, right? So if I'm having to do a mission that's more important than anything about me as an individual and whether my survival matters or not, I will override any other experience other than achieving my goal. And there are like caveats to this, but that would be one of the bigger issues, is understanding, well, then if pain is a threat perception, and then it's meant to draw our attention to the area, so it's goal directed, I can override attentional focus with distractionary based techniques. And this can get really interesting with the discussion. And there's research that looks at this, like talking to people about their painful experience while doing a task that they've previously associated with pain can cause pain perception and severity to increase. But if I come in and I distract you away from pain perception while performing an activity you previously associated with pain, with giving you something else to think about, then you can perform that task with decreased pain perception. I think this was a Sullivan paper that did this with low back pain, having people lift objects one time through and rate their pain while lifting. And then they went back through and rated how heavy they thought the object was while lifting. And that altered pain perception between the two experiences. So that's the other really important thing, is trying to get people to understand that topic. So just starting with our difficulties of communicating about it, me trying to understand it from your experience, and then realizing, like, what does it mean to be in pain and how can we best help you work through that process? Hopefully I didn't get too far off topic there.
No, that was good. I'm kind of curious, though, if you can, I don't want to say so easily, but if you can use these different kind of tools to modulate the experience of pain, what does that say about the actual area transmitting that pain signal, right? Is there anything actually going on? Is it just something that's been learned over time, is to associate this with pain? And then do you ever have a conversation with the patient where it's like, hey, you can do this movement under this circumstance and there's no pain? So that should kind of shine a light on the fact that there may not be anything wrong. And it's just kind of this thing you've been dealing with over time, and you've learned to associate pain with that movement or that area. Do you ever have that sort of conversation? Is it that direct? Do you have a way of kind of dressing it up?
It depends on the person. So I think the first thing would be like pain signal would be where I would start. So we have nociception, which are there are nerve cells called nociceptors that are in our body that senses tissue damage, thermal, mechanical, and chemical. And then those signals are sent up to the brain, and then based off of past experiences, current belief systems, contextual cues out of the environment, and sensory input, which would be the nociception, then we can have the perception of pain. And so kind of like what predictive processing is showing us is that we have this downward stream from the brain with these expectations about the world meeting with our sensory input that are upstream inputs. So we have this top-down and bottom-up approach kind of coming to head. And if our predictive processing doesn't match our expectations of what the incoming input is, then we can have what's called a predictive error. And then that could be correlated to the painful experience. So I think this is the first thing to start with that is it can get really complex with this topic. But what I try to tell people is, ask me your question one more time, because I feel like I just got way off track with that.
So like if you put someone in a situation where they experience pain and you're somehow able to direct their attention away from it, perform the same movement, and there's a lack of pain, right? I think that would kind of show you that there may not be damage to that area. So what does that conversation look like if you're illuminating the fact that, hey, you might be all right there, especially if something comes back and it's negative, the x-rays or whatever, there's been plenty of time from the injury or all that stuff.
Yeah, I think the other thing would be like, just reminded me a little bit, so thank you, is like, I wouldn't tell them there's nothing wrong with you. Mm-hmm. In most cases, depending on the personality, because that can be a bit almost received as not trusting. So if you came to me and you were having, chronic pain for 10 years, and I was like, well, there's nothing wrong with you, you'd be like, fuck you, man. I've been living with this for 10 years. Like, what do you mean there's nothing wrong with me? And so that would be a really difficult task. But some people can handle that. Some people, I've had patients where I can have a conversation and be like, there's nothing to panic about here. You're going to be okay. This will get better. And they do really well with that. Some people you have to show, for having fear avoidance behavior. And you think because you've had persistent pain in your low back for 10 years, you're like, well, I can't pick anything more than my shoe up off of the ground, or I'm just going to be wiped for days. It's like, all right, well, that's what you think. Now I need to challenge that as a clinician. And so I may not like have an overt conversation about it, but I may put them in positions in which they think they can't do something, but I'll put them in a non-threatening position or slightly threatening. And then eventually over time, exposure through that threat, they get better at handling it. So we're altering learned responses ultimately. Like that's where we're hedging our bets on this stuff is, can I educate you about what is pain? And then can I alter your learned response? So your learned response is, I can't pick my shoe up off the ground without experiencing pain. I've got to challenge that. And the only way I can challenge it is get you to do it. And then once I get you to do it, and then once we start, say, deadlifting, we load up a barbell, and before you know it, you're picking up body weight off the ground. That shoe is no longer as threatening as it once was because you realized you're much more resilient.
Yeah, so it's almost like training in the sense of you're trying to progressively overload a certain movement pattern. And you kind of mentioned it there with the personality types. Do you see a correlation between the experience of pain or susceptibility to the experience and certain personality types? So someone that's more neurotic, someone that's more open to experience, certain personality traits like that. Have you seen anything in the literature or from your direct experience?
Yeah, there's a couple things we see that reoccurs in the research literature. If you have high anxiety, we would have to have a conversation. What is high anxiety? But so that would be the first thing that can kind of perpetuate persistent pain experiences. If you're catastrophizing, which means like that could go hand in hand with high anxiety, but the kind of three big things with catastrophizing are rumination about the issue you're experiencing, so you constantly think about it. Magnification, so I kind of call this like the Chicken Little experience where the sky is falling down on you, right? It's like the worst possible scenario is going to happen. There's no questioning it. And then learned helplessness, and learned helplessness gets really interesting. It's this thought process that I'm not in control, so you don't have an internal locus of control. You think that everything that happens is outside of your own control. And this gets really interesting, and this kind of can get difficult for people. But the point of learned helplessness, what we're trying to alter is we need to operate from a position of you're not at the mercy of your pain, you're in control of it, which means we're operating from a premise of acceptance. And that can be a really difficult thing for someone to take on and say, wait a second, I'm supposed to accept the fact that I'm in pain. You don't understand. I've been in a ton of pain for decades. And I'm like, well, if we start with acceptance, that means we realize it's a part of life. And that's a much different conversation of that it's not in your control. You're at the mercy of your pain and you can't function because of it, and switches it over to everyone experiences it. It's a part of life. You can handle this. Here's how you're going to handle it.
Yeah, and just
and that, go ahead.
I was just going to say from personal experience, whenever I interact with an athlete who kind of comes to me and makes reference to their pain, they talk about they're going to get this treatment from a physical therapist or a massage therapist or a chiropractor, and then they go get some sort of treatment, say dry needling, right? They come back, and then that experience of pain almost pops up immediately. So besides education, do you think those treatments are useful in treating chronic pain or acute pain? And then how would you implement them, right? So if you had an athlete come to you and they said, hey, I really need this dry needling to take care of this issue. How would you go about pairing education with the treatment? And then is it a matter of just weaning off of the treatment, just exposing them to it less? Like, what's that decision-making process look like?
Yeah, so I have this is an interesting discussion. So pretty much how I practice clinically is I educate, and then I develop exercise programs specific to what you're trying to accomplish. Like that's all I do. I educate and we use exercise. I like exercise a lot for a couple of reasons, but I think it would be short-sighted of me to not say that exercise also can be a placebo, and probably is in a lot of scenarios. So with that said, we would have to have the discussion of like, well, what is a placebo, which means we can get a positive outcome. The official definition is with an inert, so a substance-based thing, an inert substance. So it has no like active components to it. And this gets a lot of like randomized controlled trials for drug testing and stuff like that, right? But we should be doing these types of trials as well for such interventions like dry needling to see, is this better than sham? Is this better than no treatment at all? But a lot of times a control arm is going to get better because natural regression to the mean, pain will regress back down to baseline. We just tend to freak out when it's really, really high. So that's how I practice is education and exercise. I use exercise in addition to most likely the analgesic effects based on placebo-like contextual effects, because it teaches you self-efficacy. If you think you can't pick up your shoe and you go pick up your body weight, you now have this internal locus of control where you feel like, oh, I can do this. I am capable of this. I am resilient. My spine's not going to burst because I bent over to pick something up. And so I'm not aware of any passive treatment that can instill such self-efficacy in someone. If you lie on the table and someone just joint manipulates you or massages you or dry needles you, the most likely thing that's happening is the narrative that's being provided to you to validate that treatment is a false narrative. It's being based off of things we don't have good evidence to support, like myofascial trigger points, or misaligned bones like subluxations from the chiropractic world, or you need to be massaged because your muscle is tight. Well, we can't really define tightness of a muscle. So that means I'm giving you a false narrative that perpetuates this idea that something's wrong with you that needs to be fixed. Now, if we're really trying to make you an autonomous creature who believes in yourself and is capable in life without me, that's going to do the exact opposite of those things. That's going to tell you you're broken and you need to be fixed, and I'm the person to fix you. Great for business, not so good for you getting better and realizing you can get yourself better. So I tend to stay away from that kind of stuff. I think overall, we are perpetuating persistent pain, we as clinicians, because we are giving false narratives to people. So we play a major role in this idea, and we have supportive research for this. We've polled people who are dealing with persistent back pain, and we've asked them, where did your narratives come from? The last study I read was 89% came from their healthcare professional. So their ideas, their thoughts, their beliefs about their low back pain came from healthcare professionals, which means if we're disseminating false narratives, then we're perpetuating your behavioral system. We're perpetuating you avoiding things, you thinking something's wrong with you.
Yeah, and speaking to some of the language you just used kind of to describe how people view themselves, I've experienced that firsthand. I had an interaction with someone at a gym, and they were saying that they need to go get an adjustment because I mean, literally word for word, they feel broken, right? And they need to get kind of pieced back together. And the chiropractor is the only person that can do that. But here she was squatting over 225 for reps and deadlifting near 300 pounds for reps. And it's like, but do you think someone just putting their hands on your body is going to like fix whatever bit of pain that you're experiencing right now? And anecdotally, I've heard from people that there can be an increase in the experience of pain after something like manual therapy. So what's kind of going on if someone sees a manual therapist, gets something like ART or Graston or something like that, and then there's an increase in the experience of pain?
I'm not sure with that one. That would be interesting. I've not seen that. I think it would be contextually related, right? Yeah. So if we can get decreased pain based on contextual cues, which means things like therapeutic alliance is the big ones. The therapeutic alliance is a fancy way of saying, you trust me, we're operating as a team to get you where you want to be, and you're involved in the process. That's good therapeutic alliance. Contextual cues would be things like, from a social and cultural standpoint, my friends went and had this treatment who were dealing with similar pain, and they got better from it. The other side of that would be, I told you as a clinician who you have good therapeutic alliance with that you're going to get better from it. That's going to affect it. And then your belief system. Do I believe this is what's wrong with me and this is going to make me better? So all of those things can, and we just coined the umbrella term for that, contextual cues, can mitigate pain. So my thought process would be, without seeing any research on this, if you're getting an increase in pain perception post-treatment, then there's a good likelihood that the contextual cues are at play here as well. But it depends. Like, people do some ridiculous shit with things like Graston. We see it on Instagram all the time. Like, when you got treated, they scraped my back, and the back looks like someone just ran over them with a truck. You're like, what the fuck happened? I thought you were going to get better, you know? So that's interesting. I think it would be a lot to do with contextual effects and their belief system there. Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes we just I kind of hear people talk freely about themselves, and they use such like aggressive language. And yeah, when you look at the literature on the placebo effect or the power of belief, it's so impactful to where, you know, they'll have groups. For example, I just looked at a study. They had a group taking a carbohydrate supplement. They had a group taking water, and then a group that didn't know what they were taking. And then, you know, somehow they thought the group taking carbohydrate that knew, they would have a bigger increase, but it was actually the group that didn't know what they were taking. Sorry, I think I might have gotten that the other way around. They weren't taking the supplement. They thought they were, and they saw an increase. The group that actually took it and knew they were didn't, right? So
yeah, there's
that power there. Another study on anabolic steroids. I'll link these below, but I think it just exposes the power of belief. Do you think if someone's aware of something being a placebo, that would influence the effect of the treatment? So like an open label placebo, do you think that would be as powerful or less so?
I think it can still be very powerful. Kapchik would be the person to look at for his research on this topic. He's done open label placebo studies on like irritable bowel syndrome. And what they found, if I remember the statistic correctly, and I can't remember the sample size on this, but they did an open label placebo treatment where they were basically like, yeah, this is a placebo, but if you believe it's going to make you better, then there's a high probability you're going to feel better, and power of the mind. And they got like a 58% pain reduction out of it. All because people either A, wanted to really believe that it was going to help them, or B, they believed that they were being tricked and thought it was an actual drug they were being given, despite what they were being told by the researchers. So yeah, I think it absolutely can play a role. To circle back to the people having increased pain, one thing that could be happening is a nocebo, which would be a net negative post-treatment from the clinician, and that's a big deal in the research world. We talk about that. The researchers talk about that a lot, and I try to talk about it with people when I'm educating them. Is my words can cause a negative on you. And so we were talking earlier about low back pain and where people got their beliefs from their healthcare professional. If I told you you have an L4, L5 disc herniation, and that if you keep picking up weight off of the ground, you're going to make things worse, and eventually I'm going to have to go in there and fix that and do a laminectomy or a discectomy or fusion, and you need to stop that. You can't handle it. You shouldn't exercise anymore. I've just noceboed you, right? Now you're a very fragile individual who feels incapable and most likely questioning your identity a bit. If you're an athlete who likes to train, you now feel as though you'll never train again. And you see this all the time on Instagram, like people are posting pictures of their MRIs and they're like, what am I going to do? They're saying this is wrong with me. And it's like, you know, depending on your age, welcome to the rest of the world. We are biological creatures who age, and that happens. These are adaptive aging processes. So it's nothing really to freak out about. Now, me using that language is very, very different than me telling you your L4, L5 disc protrusion serious. You need to be careful. Don't pick things up off of the ground anymore. That's a very different discussion.
Yeah, I guess what would your opinion be on trying to unify kind of the language each practitioner uses, kind of their approach to treatment? Because obviously if you're going to a physician and you're getting this harsh language that does cause a nocebo effect, right? And then you're coming to someone like yourself who's trying to educate and be very precise with what you're saying and how you implement some sort of loading progression to help the athlete build their kind of self-reliance, right? How do we unify everyone to come to this common understanding of pain as this complex topic that is very sensitive to outside influence?
Yeah, that's a $1 billion question. I wish I had the answer. I'm trying. I plan on putting out a pain science course for clinicians online. I'm going to try to get it into a local college psychology department. My hope is that if I can get enough people on board, that together we can shift this paradigm. But it won't happen by one person. It's just not possible. And I think that we let a lot of things get in our way as clinicians: party lines, titles. I'm a DC, I'm a PT, I'm an MD, I'm a DO. You know, I have this paradigm of thinking about how to practice and how to treat the topic of pain. And in reality, this isn't a title problem or a professional problem. This is a healthcare problem. This is a societal, cultural problem that the only way we're going to be able to handle it is we dissolve this idea that people are against each other and that I have the right answer to treat you. It is, we need to start looking at what the research says and collectively come together and shift how we're approaching this topic of pain.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, when I first got introduced to kind of the information you put out, I did see DC at the end of your name, and that kind of raised the assumptions of using certain treatments and taking a certain approach. And it's really interesting to see that you've kind of gone beyond that and adopted what you believe to be the best form of treatment, because that is kind of how I see most people directing their action, is like, this person is a physical therapist. They should be using these types of treatments on these types of problems. Not necessarily just seeing that as a way to kind of get the door open, right? If I got some sort my DPT, and that's just a way to expose myself to the general population of athletes, I can change the way I practice. I don't have to feel tied into the school or the methods or the people I studied under. So I think that's really responsible and very very useful for yourself to kind of take a different approach. So as far as where you would like to see the advancement of the field, you kind of mentioned what you're going to do, but what would you like to see change in the field of rehabilitation and how people approach rehabbing injuries?
I think education should be a much greater focus than what it is, for sure. I've been at various clinics. I had the opportunity to kind of teach around the country last year, and then I work with a lot of different people. But I think that our system of healthcare currently is greatly constraining our ability to educate people and to have conversations with people. We are solidified in this model of treatment with ICD-10 codes and CPT codes from the standpoint of, I'm treating spondylolisthesis, I'm treating rotator cuff tear, I'm not treating Bob, I'm not treating Susan, I'm not treating a person, I'm treating this problem, right? And so I think it needs to start with relationship forming and education. I think that would be the biggest shift I would want to see. And then in rehab, we need to make sure with our treatments that we are instilling self-efficacy and we're building people up and getting them to realize they're very resilient. And you wouldn't have survived for as long as we've survived on this world if you weren't. It just wouldn't happen, right? And then giving them the tools that they need to self-manage. So realize, like, if pain is a part of life, what matters is how do I deal with it? And we're all going to have good days. We're all going to have bad days. We're all going to have great days. What matters is how we respond to each of those, right? And this is kind of what led me down like stoicism and philosophy and stuff, which very much falls in line to my mindset with it. But getting people to realize that. And so that would be a really good thing. For the athletic world, I think the biggest complaint I currently have, and something I'm hoping to change with Barbell Medicine with some templates I'm going to be releasing, is the appropriate dosage of loading for the athlete with specificity designed for their sport. So what I usually see, regardless of who's treating, is just some silly nonsense that has nothing to do with the athlete's sport of choice. It has nothing to do with titrating up loading from a volume and intensity standpoint to get them ready to go back to sport. And we're really shitty at that. And so hopefully I'm going to release some templates that kind of help clinicians do that and help athletes do that. But coupled together, that's kind of what I would want to see all together.
Yeah, you kind of touched on the impact of education. So when you educate someone, I think we did touch on this a little earlier, and they go out into the world and they're exposed to all these different inputs, maybe from their family. How do you kind of deal with their other conversations, right? Do you just tell them to start educating other people? Is that something that you think is going to be more impactful than trying to put out something? Because obviously you can't interact with their family and their friends. So is it just a matter of educating the patient educates another person or two people, and it kind of feeds forward that way?
Yeah, that's the hope. I mean, we do have to look at, there's studies on like spousal influence and significant other influences on persistent pain development, their responses and how that manipulates things, and the genetic traits as far as it goes with the experience of persistent pain. So there are some like familial based issues. The hope would be, and I tell people this all the time, I'm like, bring the person in. They're welcome to sit in on the visit. They're welcome to talk to us. I think we need to be accessible if we're going to make this paradigm shift. And then hopefully they kind of tell people, and then their family tells people, you know, we need to be publicly writing more at a level that can be utilized and digestible by the general public. That's something I hope to do more in the future, especially in 2019. And I think that's going to be the only way. It comes down to like, how do you educate at a massive scale? Well beyond like what we see for individual schools. Like if we were reliant on the DPT schools and DC schools and medical schools to make the shift, I think it's gonna be really tough because the majority of schools teach towards passing boards, and that's just the way it's set up. So I think if we waited for that to happen, this paradigm shift is going to take a really, really long time. So we need to massively scale up quickly as we can, which just to me means like we've got to use things like the internet.
Yeah, I think there's an importance there, and people say it all the time, right? So we release this podcast, and it's like, hey, share it with your family and friends, and really that's a way to expose them to a different way of thinking, right? Sharing the articles that you've written, and kind of passing those on. So I think when someone, maybe someone listening, consumes this information, it is useful to take a second to think about, if I share this, what impact will it have? And then also creating content, right? So just because there are a lot of research articles about the topic doesn't mean that it's useless to write about known knowledge. Just because it's not new to you doesn't mean it won't be new to someone else. So I guess kind of before we go forward, I do have a couple other questions, but you mentioned it earlier with the programming. So if someone comes in with some chronic issue, say an overuse injury of a certain joint that's specifically used frequently in the sport, we'll say maybe like a knee tendonitis or something like that, what's your process of bringing them back to 100% and then kind of dealing with the underlying pathology or diagnosis?
Yeah, that's interesting. We would have to start with like how we're going to define injury in the athletic world. I think that's a big topic of debate currently. It is a big topic of debate. Currently, it's defined as any loss of play or training due to the reporting of pain and or dysfunction or loss of function. And that's a bit of a tricky definition because in the kind of reality of things, if you think you're hurt, then you're hurt, right? And so how do you tease out when is someone actually quote unquote hurt and when is this a different discussion, right? And so I think that's difficult. I've been working on this shoulder piece for a while for athletes, And one of the topics of it is the overhead athlete. And so we have a lot more evidence of what aren't pathologies and what aren't issues than what we have for this is an issue from a pathological standpoint. And that can be broadly zoomed out from a lot of different issues and a lot of different populations. We have more evidence of what isn't a pathology that we should be calling adaptations than we do have evidence for this is a pathology that needs intervention from a standpoint of like.
How do you tease that out?
I don't know that it's possible.
That's a really interesting question, and I'm curious to hear because I've seen people experience all these discomforts and types of pain, and it is when is it appropriate to take time off? What is it appropriate to change exercises? These are like big questions if you're leading up to a meet, right?
Well, if it's a meet, that's a different story. That's going to be, let's set expectations here. If we're peaking, sometimes we got to embrace the suck a little bit and just keep going for competition's sake. But I think overall, the biggest thing we have right now that evidence supports would be like subjective, our session RPE, which is a subjective marker of fatigue levels, right? Rate of perceived exertion. Eckert et al. Did a recent article, a systematic review on the loading variables linked to injury risk. And so we know we should be tracking session RPE and RPE for daily exercise. That's a big one. So if you feel as though you're fatigued, and then the other thing I couple with is a observable, recorded decrement in objective performance, meaning that A, you feel subjectively fatigued more than you usually do, and that's a consistent reporting. That's not just a single session. And B, you're having decremental performance, so your performance is going down. Let's say if you're a weightlifter, when you're training clean and jerk and snatch, they're not living up to what they previously did, and you say you've done like a 5 rep for back squat or something, and that number consistently is going down and your RP is going up, that's a problem. Something's going on that we need to address it. And so it's having a conversation with the athlete, what's life looked like? It could be we're titrating up volume and intensity too quickly than you can handle. And that is extremely individualistic. And we've talked about this in Barbell Medicine is I can't write a program for everyone. It's just not possible. You're going to have different variable responses to exercise and to templates, right? But seeing maybe for you as an individual, given everything that's going on in life, we're too quickly titrating up volume and intensity. So we need to figure out how can we manipulate that, or how can we manipulate rest days. And all of this is dependent upon where you're at in your season of competition. And then from there, what does recovery stuff look like? So what are our best tools for recovery? Training load management, fatigue level management. And then it's going to be psychosocial variables. How are you coping with life and what's happening in life? Because that very much plays a role. Again, if we take this and we mirror this to the discussion of pain, it's basically treating the athlete like a human being and a person and discussing everything that makes you as the human being and the person. And how are you handling all of those things and how does that play a role in training? So that would be kind of how that discussion goes down with them. I think that answers your question.
Yeah, it did. Well, and kind of to your point, I think Mike Teixeira's talked about this. He talks about trying to predict somebody's time to peak, right? So if you're training for 3 weeks and you peak on the 3rd week and you're down on the 4th week, don't keep pushing into the next week and the next week trying to elongate the peak performance, because sometimes it's just a predictable pattern that we can exploit. So then when someone does experience something that is noteworthy enough to alter their plan, what does that look like bringing them back to peak performance?
It's just titrating back up appropriately and being smart about it. We have some variables that I use in my templates that are going to be released with Barbell Medicine, like acute on chronic workload ratios, which would be Tim Gabbett, and people have replicated that as well. So looking at so let's define this, like the acute training load for an individual athlete could be a single training session, or for the team-based sport athlete, a week worth of training and practice. The chronic load would be the average of the prior 4 weeks. And this would be, if we were doing this as an uncoupled AC ratio, this would be the acute compared to the chronic, non-inclusive of the prior 4 weeks. If it's a coupled ratio, it would be acute compared to chronic, inclusive of the acute week or the acute session. And so what do we mean by workload? Well, what we usually see with this for team-based sport athletes is going to be session RPE, rate of perceived exertion on a scale of 1 to 10, times duration of training, which would be if it's 60 minutes and you rate it a 70, 420, and we call this an arbitrary unit. It's just what it's called. It's not called anything else. I wish we had a better name for it, but that's what it's called in the research. And so you're just tracking that. So what I try to do is use a heuristic of, I don't like to see larger than 10% increases across the board from session to session in order to help titrate that load up appropriately. Could some people probably handle 10.5, 11%, 12, 15? Probably. Is it worth taking the risk if I'm like putting out a template that a ton of people are going to use? No, I would rather err on the side of caution and say keep it at 10% and then titrate up appropriately. If you as a responder find out I can respond to more than that, then that's cool. Go for that. But overall, that's kind of what we want to see. The official parameters for AC ratios is you don't want to see it below 0.8 or above 1.3. When you get into the 1.5 range or you get below 0.8, we see increased injury occurrences on both sides. So this U-shape approach to injury occurrences and decreasing performance. The caveat to all of this is the majority of AC ratios is predicated on team-based sport athletes, so soccer, football, rugby, stuff like that. We don't have very much, if at all, that I'm aware of on barbell-based sports.
Yeah,
we're extrapolating.
Kind of interested to hear how you would recommend. I mean, obviously a session RPE will be different from individual set RPEs. So if you have a powerlifter who is kind of guiding the weight by the RPE, you can average that out at, say, if all sets are at an 8 and you adjust the weight accordingly, we average that out at an 8. If all exercises are at an 8, would you say the session's roughly an 8 RPE?
That depends on the person. Yeah. And this is interesting because it's like, you'll see people do, recently, I joke around with a clinician friend on Instagram, and I did a squat video, and I rated it like an RPE of 7.5 or something. He's like, dude, that totally looked like a 9. Well, here's the fun thing about RPE. It's subjective, just like pain. So if you feel like it's a 9, regardless of what it looks like, it's a 9, and no one could really question that,
Yeah.
And so I don't know that I've not seen data to say that exercise rated set to set with RPE is directly correlated to session RPE. I would think intuitively it should be. If I'm looking at all of your sets and you're hitting 8s and then you're reporting to me that session RPE was a 4, I might question that a little bit.
And then for a weightlifter who is a more obviously skill-based athlete, you can't necessarily rate the RPE of a 85% clean and jerk. So what are your recommendations there? Is it just kind of perception of fatigue? And then what do you mean by fatigue when you say that? Is it a feeling of tiredness? Is it, X, Y, and Z? When you tell someone rate your RPE based on the session and the fatigue, this is what fatigue will be like.
Yeah, so I'm going to take just a second to pull up the official definition of fatigue because I don't want to misquote this, and this is actually a good discussion on it. So give me just a second. I'll pull it up for you. In the seminar I give with Derek Miles, we actually talk about this. I do a lecture on cueing and scaling and exercise prescription for the athlete, and we talk about, what is fatigue. So give me just a second.
Yeah. And if you guys are interested, you can sign up for one of Michael's seminars. The link will be posted in the description below, as will all of his information. So be sure to go and check that stuff out when you get an opportunity.
For the weightlifter, though, I think there's still validity, and I'd be interested in hearing others' thoughts in utilizing session RPE. Now, I have heard people report that it's very tough to say, this is what an 85% clean and jerk felt like. But I think overall, I would still try to use session RPE. Some people like RIRs, which still I guess could be difficult for the weightlifter. But to me, overall, fatigue just means your subjective feeling of things. Like, how are you feeling? Do you feel recovered? Do you feel capable? Do you feel as though you're able to go do the rest of the things in your day that you need to do, or you're going to be dragging ass the rest of the day? I believe, I'm trying to pull it up, it's taking a second.
And before you do that, do you ever have people rate how they feel before the session to see if it kind of correlates with the session RPE, right? So if someone comes in and they're dragging and they feel awful, and then they train and they have like this awesome performance. Do you do that as like a comparison? I think it would kind of highlight how much a person's perception kind of influences the RPE rating.
I don't like outright ask what their RPE is coming into it, but what I tell people is based on how you're subjectively feeling, the RPE of 5 could be very different from day to day.
Okay.
So if you're scheduled to hit an RPE of 5, and let's say you're using like you mentioned Mike earlier, and using like a calculation prediction for your repetition maximum, it has a percentage there, and if you're going by that, maybe you're not able to hit that percentage because the RPE 5 that day is different than what it was yesterday. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So like the RPE kind of scales.
Yep.
Interesting.
I call it basically the great equalizer. Now, is it perfect? No, it's definitely not. But to me, and based on what I've seen in the research evidence thus far, it's probably one of the better markers we have for trying to objectify a subjective experience.
How do you ensure progression when you're kind of under the guise of RPE, right? Because some people think, okay, it's an RPE 8, I go in, I hit this weight. What if a weight kind of is maintained from week to week and there's no kind of push into that adaptive zone because people are so focused on what their perception of an 8 is, if it's actually kind of close to what you would consider an 8, as you kind of made the example of your friend and then yourself rating it.
So they're just not challenging themselves ultimately.
Yeah.
Like I mean, and that's where you can help give like estimations. Like you should be trying to hit these numbers today, and these should be around an RPE of this. But obviously, if you get into your warm-up sets and you're dragging ass that day, you didn't have good nutritional intake the days before, you've been really stressed out from, say, school because you're a student athlete, then that's going to kind of manipulate what you're able to achieve. And that just takes a coach kind of going back over prior training history and looking at, well, what are they capable of, which helps you have an understanding of maybe I should step in here and be like, you need to really, if you can, push today and see where we can get. And if they're feeling, to me, RPE basically says the days that you're feeling really good, you can push. The days that you're feeling not so great, to back off.
Okay.
And so it kind of lets you manipulate, I guess the best way to talk about it would be like undulate your loading according to what you're capable of that day.
Okay. And when you program, is it kind of this progression of RPE to kind of push into that adaptive zone?
Yeah.
So like maybe a 7 and then an 8 and then a 9 and then pull back to last week, go back to maybe a 7 or 6? Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. And like if we're talking, so like the rehab supplements I'm going to release, and one of the things I say about rehab is there's nothing special about rehab. It is all just exercise. There are no corrective exercises. There are no this one trick exercise that you haven't been doing, and that's why you're experiencing issues. It is just exercise. And hopefully if the clinician's really good, it's exercise specifically programmed for what you're trying to accomplish. And so with that said, like rehab will start with my templates at a lower RPE, because my assumption is if you're having high sensitization, so you're having high pain perception, then we probably aren't going to have this willingness to try to hit an RPE of 8, right? Because we're talking about subjective intensity, trying to correlate it to objective intensity, which would be the load on the barbell, so to speak, or an external intensity versus an internal intensity. So my hope then is if I start you at lower RPEs, you can kind of feel confident that you can accomplish those tasks, and then I just titrate it up over time. So 1 week could be like a 3 to 4 RPE, the next week 4 to 5, the next week 5 to 6, so on and so forth. And before you know it, we've got you back at baseline of where you were at before you had to deal with this issue.
I think what would be interesting, so I did get a couple questions, and you mentioned exercise selection there. I got a question looking at kind of tendinitis and how to manage it and get rid of it. Are there any correlates to where we can say if a muscle is weak, it's more predisposed to a certain type of injury? I know that's probably not something that you would want to discuss with someone, but have you seen anything? Because when I look at some rehab literature, maybe for knee tendinitis or quadriceps tendinitis, they prescribe leg extensions or quad strengthening exercises. So is there a correlate of a weak muscle group and then a predisposition to injury?
Yeah, I have, and just kind of a side note, I found that fatigue definition when you want to talk about that. I have kind of mixed feelings on this idea. first, we have to define what is strong and what is weak. And that's actually a lot more complicated than most people realize, right? So it's relative. You have to put it into context. What are we talking about? Are you an 83 kilogram power lifter? Are you strong in comparison to your cohort? And is that cohort at the regional level, the state level, the national level, the world level? So now the strength parameters of how we're defining it have changed, right? And so I don't think we have a good definition for what is strong and what is weak. This creates a dichotomy. It's probably much more on a spectrum. So with that said, I don't tend to talk about things in that manner, especially when we're discussing the topic of pain. But we do have research evidence on like the knee rehab template I'm going to release. I say that people can use it if they're experiencing and this is certainly a rabbit hole we could go down, but they get the title of patellofemoral pain syndrome, which is not a great diagnosis in and of itself for a lot of different reasons. But you're experiencing knee pain basically behind or in and around the patella, right? We do have research that says a risk factor for developing PS symptoms is extensor weakness. And we have to be like, well, how do we define that? Well, relative to the people that were included in the study, they were weak comparatively. Okay, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So then, go ahead.
And then kind of going off of that, would you ever consider a weakness as compared to the antagonist muscle group? So quadricep strength as compared to maybe hamstring strength?
Yep, you can do that. You'll see that for ACL reconstruction research as far as quad hamstring ratios. Outside of that, I don't think that it probably has too much utility at all whatsoever. And that's more of return to play post ACL reconstruction, not as a preventative measure, which we could also have a discussion on. But yeah, we see that like extensor weakness as a risk factor. And then the treatment thereof, like the latest systematic review on that was hip and knee strengthening exercises, oddly enough, right? That's kind of how that works. But I don't like saying, because, you know, if we were to go down that rabbit hole, I've seen people who are capable of pulling 700 pounds off the ground and they have low back pain. Well, you're not weak by any of the standards I have, you know, that I understand, and you're probably competing at the national level depending on your weight class. So I'd say you're doing pretty well from a strength perspective. So pain just can't be reduced like that. Okay,
and then actually going into the question itself, if someone is looking to manage tendonitis or get rid of it entirely, I mean, I don't know. I guess it's weird to phrase this in a specific way because it's such a general question. But do you see many cases of tendonitis kind of sticking around through the entirety of someone's lifting career if it's gone on long enough? I mean, what's the likelihood of something being resolved entirely? And then the last question I guess I would have is it common for it to reoccur frequently?
Yeah, I think we have to define our terms with this. So we tend to shift away from tendonitis overall as a field because we've realized that it doesn't always relate to inflammation. And there are degrees to this conversation, but on the whole, it's difficult to say you're experiencing tendinopathic issues from an inflammatory process or perspective. And itis means inflammation to an area. So if we're talking like patellar tendinopathy, we used to say patellar tendonitis. Opathy just means that something's going on in that tendon, and it's kind of a broad scoping utilization of the term. But as far as like experiencing of symptoms, no, not necessarily. I don't see a reason why someone would consistently experience it throughout their career unless their load and fatigue wasn't being appropriately managed. Like that's all of the research we have on how to handle tendinopathies is centered around this is a discussion of loading. So you have three types of, and I don't know how into the weeds you want to get onto this, so feel free to be like, dude, shut up. You have three types of tendinopathies. You have reactive, which think youth athlete, less than like 25 years of age. They went out and did something they weren't ready to do, either an acute volume increase or an acute intensity increase. They didn't adapt to it, and so they got some symptoms out of it. The next phase would be degenerative. So that would be someone my age. If you scanned all of my tendons with an ultrasound, I'm pretty confident in saying you're going to find some degeneration in my tendons. And that usually occurs asymptomatically, meaning you have no pain and no reported dysfunction. So that's a pretty readily occurring thing where we're now saying, well, that's a normal aging adaptation, most likely that's occurring. The third phase would be reactive on degenerative. Think someone my age or older. They did the same thing the younger kid did, but they didn't adapt to volume and intensity increases at all either. They're symptomatic. So that's kind of the three big categories of tendinopathies. If you follow Joe Cook's research, Joe Cook says treat the donut, not the hole, which basically says if you're dealing someone with degenerated tendons, it's really not a big deal. You can't make any difference in that degenerated tendon that's meaningful anyways. And the research on morphological changing of a tendon is pretty sketchy in and of itself, and that's a whole nother discussion. So what we say is we'll treat the rest of the tendon that doesn't have degeneration. What is degeneration? That's things like misaligned collagen formation in the area. So you introduce exercise to the area to try to help out with that issue. If we're appropriately managing load and fatigue, we should get resolution. And typically you do get resolution pretty quickly. The problem with the tendinopathy is because it's a loading-based issue, you're probably already self-selecting load to the area because you don't want to experience symptoms. So your baseline for your fitness level has already started to drop down, right? And then if I come in and we start getting symptomatic resolution, you're like, fuck yeah, this feels great. I'm going to go do X, and you quickly titrate up again, you're probably going to end up in the same boat. But if I come in and I say, hey, we're going to get to X, that's going to happen, but we got to stair step it back up there again. And that's kind of like what these templates come in and do. So everything we see with heavy slow resistance is the umbrella term for this, which is doing tempo base loading to the area. The thought is we keep you under tension for as long as possible, and then we increase load. Oddly enough, it's in a linear progressive fashion. So like high volume, low intensity first week, and then you slowly titrate up and flip the tube where now you're at high intensity, low volume. Oddly enough, that's the treatment for this stuff. But I think there's no reason if someone started developing patellar tendinopathy, there's no reason that they shouldn't get resolution, and they shouldn't, if they've worked with a good clinician, have a better understanding of load management. And so they can kind of keep going. And there's nothing to say like that's going to be the end of your career. But if someone comes in, I've seen Achilles tendinopathy cases. Someone comes in and has been told, well, I should never jump again because my Achilles is going to rupture because they said it's degenerated. Well, you may end your own career because of the information you've been given. You've been noceboed and you think, fuck this, I don't want to rupture my Achilles. I'm just not going to play basketball again, or I'm not going to go do this, right?
Yeah, and then I guess something a little more along the lines of something that's not consistent, but that kind of infrequently reappears. So I got a question. I was looking at like pain in the back, right around the head and neck, very, very general, but it just kind of comes and goes, and it's maybe experienced 3 times a year for a couple weeks at a time. If someone were to present that information to you without anything else, is it kind of just a matter of, if it doesn't affect your training, just kind of train through it, and it's just something that pops up?
Yeah, if we accept the premise is pain is a part of life and what matters is how do we deal with it, that will frame that situation very differently. And it's not me being like apathetic. It's me saying, I hear you. I understand what you're experiencing. Let's not panic about it. Let's keep trying to train and see what we can get done. If it affects training, we'll make adjustments as needed. If not, it's no worse for wear. And given that it's happened multiple times and it keeps improving on its own, and then you're probably going to be okay. The discussion I try to have with people in those scenarios as well is like, let's look at patterns of behavior. If you experience neck pain, and then every time you're like, well, I experienced neck pain, it got really, really bad, so I went and saw a consult somewhere, and they dry needled me, or they adjusted my neck, or they taped me, or they stretched me, and then it got better. Well, you're probably perpetuating your own situation, most likely. So your learned response is, I experienced pain, pain's bad, seek out consult, get fixed by that person, pain goes away, and then you kind of repeat that cycle year after year after year. If your response was, pain's a part of life, I'm probably going to be okay here, let's wait and see, it's going to get better, keep moving, don't let it make me be dysfunctional, meaning not do the things I need to do, it's going to resolve on its own, most likely, I just need to weather this storm. That's a much harder sell than let me go get fixed by someone else.
Yeah, and what you're saying, it kind of all comes back to a very basic approach, or very simple approach. I don't want to kind of undersell what you're saying, but when we see these very complicated and very elaborate approaches to improving performance, for example, I'm thinking of like all of the attention that breathing is getting. So we have a lot of these different groups focused on aligning the core in a certain way and breathing a certain way and doing these drills and pairing them with all these stretches. And I mean, how much value can we put into all of these different groups kind of relaying this information? Because it seems like there's something for everyone, and everyone is doing something very poorly, or is broken in some way and needs to be corrected or fixed. So for someone that's seeing this, because I personally see it all the time, that people will come to our gym and put on seminars and put on performance clinics, and it's hard to differentiate without going directly to the literature and then being able to read it and understand it and relay it in a way that's understandable. So how should people go about seeing this information and then trying to understand it and implementing it if needed?
Yeah, I think if you want to improve performance, the best thing you can do is be specific to the training that you're trying to compete at. So, and we can certainly talk about like phases of periodization and allowing like loss of specificity. But overall, if I want to be better at squatting and I want to be the best at squatting for my weight class, then I need to be squatting a lot and I need to be doing it regular. And that's where we're going to get our best bang for our buck. I wrote a really lengthy blog on Barbell Medicine's website a while back on the topic of mobility and what does it mean and how do we affect it. And everything we have as far as data goes from most of the implements that people are trying to utilize to improve performance isn't well supported. Typically, it's no better than placebo. And you're most likely wasting your money on them and wasting time and effort. I try to be as economical as I can. So I look at this on return on investment. If my commodities to invest are my time and my money and my effort, then what do I need to utilize my time doing with the most amount of my effort to get the highest return on investment, right? And that's going to be specificity of training. And that's how I talk about it with people. If you want to go waste your money on those implements, that is your choice. We live in a free society. You're welcome to spend your money whatever you want to. My hope is with research evidence, we can educate people and be like, well, let's spend our money in the most evidence-based ways we can, spend our time the most evidence-based way we can, and our efforts. And time's the one commodity we can't remanufacture. When it's gone, right? And so I would rather see my athletes utilizing best evidence to dictate practice, right, for training. When you frame it like that, people tend to realize like, oh, I don't have to foam roll. I don't have to go try to do diaphragmatic breathing, whatever the fuck that is. If you're breathing, you're using your diaphragm. It just, you tend to like, and this is why my motto is no silly bullshit. Like I very much try to go by that line of thinking. Those implements tend to fall away when we follow this premise, right? And people get better. They're able to train and they're not wasting money on things that we don't have good evidence that says they should be wasting money on. And
Yeah, I think something that's become a pet peeve of mine is people kind of misappropriating how they think they believed the results that they've achieved. They kind of misappropriate it to, well, I went to this course and learned how to breathe properly, and then I PR'd my snatch by 10 kilos. It's like, but it's obviously not the periodization, or it's obviously not the progressive overloading. It's not the technique work. It's none of these things. It's this sudden light bulb moment of I can breathe correctly.
Or the crowd around you cheering for you, exactly. The instructor that you've bought into, the money that you spent with sunk cost fallacy, all of these things are probably going to play into you PRing that day.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Kind of one thing I want to dig into right as we wrap up, you talked about it before, but tightness. I think this is something I hear in the gym probably most frequently is my muscles are really tight and I need to go stretch. So when we're feeling this sensation, maybe you can kind of explain, I guess it's kind of tricky, but what tightness is and how we should go about dealing with it if necessary.
Yeah, so I have this discussion a lot with people. What is tightness? I would say the best way we can define this currently is, and there's not a lot of discussion on this in the research evidence, but the best way we can define it currently is some area of your body doesn't feel the way you're expecting it to feel. Does that make sense? Yeah. So if someone says I have tight hamstrings, I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? If we're talking like, let's say I feel like my right hamstring's tight. Well, the area feels a different way than you're expecting it to feel. So it's perception and subjective based, and it's feeling differently than your opposite extremity, than your left side. So now we're talking about altering perception, which oddly enough is very similar to the topic of pain. I'm altering your perception of pain when we have discussions about education and the topic and we get you moving. Same thing can be said about tightness. If we don't have a good definition for it, we can't correlate it to anything meaningful from a tissue status standpoint. We're altering your subjective perception, which means I can do that a lot of different ways. I can have a conversation with you. I can set the expectation that if you go and move, you're going to feel better. I can get you moving, and I can get you moving specifically to the things you're getting ready to do in training. So if my back feels tight, that means, and I know I've got like deadlifts that day, I can go start deadlifting. And maybe I deadlift at a lower intensity, and suddenly I get warm, quote unquote, and I feel better. So my perception has changed, and I didn't waste time trying to stretch, do cat-cow, banded, whatever. I just went up and started picking up the barbell at a lower intensity, but it's specific to the task that I'm trying to compete at.
Okay, interesting. And then kind of going along with that, I maybe we can touch on posture a little bit, and how it's related to maybe the perception of pain, because I think they're kind of interrelated, right? People think because they have poor posture, it's leading to muscle tightness and muscle weakness. As far as you're concerned with posture and its relationship to pain, could you maybe elaborate a little bit of the research for us?
Yeah, the bulk of the research says that we really don't have a good definition for a dichotomy of posture. Posture is a thing. It exists. We're all in postures and out of postures throughout the day. We don't have evidence to say this is a good posture or this is a bad posture. The big one in our world and our society currently is text neck. But I mean, people have been reading items and looking down for a very long time, right? Well before the advent of the cell phone. And we're just fine. We're still alive and for the most part, somewhat functioning. So we don't have evidence for good or bad. So I don't know how people even attempt to say you're sitting in a slouched posture, you have forward head posture, your body or your head's a bowling ball that weighs now 40 pounds or whatever. We can't do that. And if anything, it's just fear mongering. Can people get sensitized to a position? Sure. The easy solution to that, change the position you're in. It is that simple. I tell patients and athletes all the time, if you want to pay me to tell you that, okay, but you can fix this on your own. You don't need me. You know what I mean? And so it's just getting people to realize that, like, we don't have evidence to say that. And in fact, we have evidence against that. We have evidence, longitudinal studies on people for like 10 and 20 years looking at modifications of posture and how things change and degenerative processes of the spine and kinematically speaking how things change, and they're asymptomatic populations, so meaning no pain and no dysfunction. So I don't get caught up with posture unless it's important to the patient, and then I have a conversation about pain, obviously, and then how they can alter their posture to meet the demands that they have for the day.
Yeah, it's so weird hearing about how delicate people are when in the reality we're incredibly resilient and able to withstand so much. Like, because I've seen people with incredibly bad technique deadlifting heavy repeatedly for years, and they're perfectly fine. And that's a situation where most people would see it and think like, oh my God, he's going to like blow his back out or whatever kind of language they use. So it's really interesting to kind of compare those experiences. So as we kind of wrap up, I do have a couple questions I ask everyone that comes on the show. These are kind of like the philosophy aspect of it. They get some insight into your views on things that are a little less objective. So as far as strength training, do you think it would be useful for everyone to adopt that habit? And what has strength training done for you as a person?
Yeah, I have a huge bias for strength training. I think everyone should be doing it. I regularly joke it's the fountain of youth. I mean, if you want to see one intervention that you can utilize as a human being that has massive effects on all-cause mortality, massive effects on morbidity, it keeps your quality of life higher comparatively, typically. You're more capable of doing things. Your self-efficacy is higher. It affects cognitive functioning as far as like decreasing the development of inability like memory and stuff like that. So cognitive function stays high. You're talking about strength training and resistance training. So literally the barbell in my mind is like, because it comes down to a question of intensity, and we know that's probably one of the better implements we have for dosing in higher intensity stuff. That should be what people are doing. They're strength training on a regular basis. I don't know of anything else that can have the impact that strength training can.
Yeah, and then in your experiences, like when you've taken it up, kind of besides the physical improvements, have you kind of noticed a change? And obviously, it's hard to kind of tease out aging and maturation, but have you noticed a difference in yourself when you started resistance training and strength training that kind of wasn't there before?
Yeah. I started when I was in high school. So I've probably been training for like 17 years now at this point. And it's definitely a difference, not only just from like physical differences and health differences, but mental differences. At this point for me, and I think this happens to a lot of people, is it becomes your identity, which is an interesting discussion for people dealing with pain and can't train because they lose a part of themselves, so to speak. But yeah, I think that it is a huge part of my life. I like to read Stoicism, and people know this. And so, like, one of the things I read today was talking about your point in life, right, is to A, try to be a good person, and we could talk about what does good mean, and B, find the thing that you love in life that you want to do. And my entire life is centered around, at this point, between opening a clinic and opening a gym, is trying to understand the experience of pain and then trying to instill self-efficacy in people to be able to take care of themselves. And I choose to do that through strength training.
Yeah. And then as a practitioner, what would you say is the worst mistake that you made? And for people listening, if they ever come into kind of a situation like that, how would you suggest they avoid it?
I would say worst mistake. I would love to sit here and say that we can help everyone. I think one of the issues we get into is we try to force our normal on people. And so we try to force the helping part as a clinician, that I want to feel as though people who are experiencing pain and discomfort and not functioning at the level they want to, I try to get them to realize there's a different way of looking at things, a different path. And you really just can't force that on people. If they're not ready to change their minds, if they're not ready to think about things differently, then you can't make that happen. But if you don't realize that, and you don't realize that, unfortunately, we can't help everyone. And I'm certainly not trying to be negative. It's just what I've seen anecdotally as the reality of the situation. You will lead a very frustrated life as a clinician. And then if you factor that in with watching what everyone else is doing and how they're accomplishing life, and let's say they're excelling at business, that's just going to magnify your frustration. You've got to decide for yourself, this is who I am, this is how I want to practice. And if I want to be evidence-based, which I hope you do, then trying to utilize the research to guide your path. And then you just kind of shut everything else out. You can't worry about how other clinicians are practicing.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I like the quote, you need to be open-minded, but not so much that your brain falls out. So kind of taking information
Right.
and thinking about how you can apply it and make a change to kind of improve your life, but not so much so that you buy into every single thing that you hear or see. And that kind of goes back to the thing we talked about before with having a conversation with someone who's resistant to change, but impacting other people that are viewing that from the outside. So that's really interesting. I think we all want to help everyone. I think that's kind of why we get into what we do, right? In the rehab field or in the performance field, is you think you have the best way of going about things, and you just want to share that with people. I mean,
Yeah.
and there's nothing wrong with that, but as long as you're doing it for the right reason. And the last question I have to kind of wrap up is, what is one thing that people can do each day to become a better person?
Oh, that's a good one. Man, where to begin? That's like a hell of a philosophy question that I feel like I need to have a beer for. What is something everyone can do every day to help others or be
For
a better
themselves to
person?
become a better person, yeah.
A better person. I would say my bias is going to be education. Read as much as you can, but not only read as much as you can about the topic of interest. And when I say read, I'm typically talking about research, but interact with others, have a discussion with others, talk to others, see what their opinions are. How do they base those opinions? Is it based on research? Do you have discourse between the two of you? What comes of that? So you can't, as easy as it would be for me to go to an island with my wife and just live there and read research for the rest of my days and then write shit, it probably wouldn't be very beneficial to the rest of humanity. I need to go out and have discussions with people and disagreements. And so that would be what I'd recommend. To better yourself is educate yourself and then try to talk and work with others.
Yeah, and kind of going along with that, it's kind of something I experienced, but just being open to being wrong, right? So I try and bring experts, not experts, but people that are very knowledgeable in their field of choice on the show and have a discussion about current topics and things of interest. And I feel like it's very nerve-wracking for me because I want to try and represent myself well, but I have to be completely open to being wrong with a few of the things that I say, and in learning how to improve on the way that I engage with other people and the language that I use. Because I think one of the overarching themes here is that it's important to understand what you're saying and how you're saying it, because every word we use carries this assumption of this idea or this belief or this definition. So if we're not all on the same page, it would just speaking past each other in a sense. So I don't know how I got on that, but that was a really insightful answer.
I totally agree. Yeah. And that's a huge premise shift. Yeah. Especially at the doctorate level, and people get high and mighty about themselves. And we talk to students about this all the time, is the premise is, can I be less wrong each day? Mm-hmm. I'm going to be wrong. I'm sure there's things that I've said wrong on this podcast that people and I could have discourse about, and we could discuss it and try to figure things out. But if I operate from the premise I'm already wrong, I just want to be less wrong, then I'm much more open to talking to others and listening to what they have to say.
Yeah, and I think also going along with that is not feeling like you've ever reached the end, right? So because you received a degree, it's not over. Learning really has just started, right? Because you have to understand how to understand information and think about it in a certain way. And I think what an education does is it prepares you. It prepares you in a sense to read that and then to think about it and try and incorporate it into your own practice. But it definitely doesn't fully prepare you for anything. I think some of the best experience we gain, or some of the best knowledge we gain, is probably in the field, right? In the gym, speaking with athletes, trying out these different ways of communicating what's right and what's wrong, or what's more right and what's more wrong. So kind of going along with that, Michael, for people who are interested in what you have to write about and what you have to say about these topics we've covered, where should we direct them to the blogs you've written, the videos you've produced, and the services that you offer?
Instagram would probably be the best place, just michael.ray.dc. You can look me up on Facebook, Michael Ray. But Instagram, I tend to be a lot more proactive on and communicative. I have Twitter. I rarely use it. And then as far as writing, everything currently is on the logic of rehab, but we have merged with Barbell Medicine as of like August this year. That website is going to be coming down. So the anything new, like the mobility blog I wrote, will be on barbellmedicine.com. And so you can find all that stuff on there. The templates I talked about will be coming out through that website. Any future seminars will be through that website. So,
yeah. And then because you've mentioned how much you like to read and what kind of information you consume, what are a few of your top resources, maybe inside the field of rehabilitation and then outside of the field of rehabilitation, going along with that stoicism comment you made earlier?
For reading for the field of rehab, I mean, it would be research, so PubMed, Google Scholar, pulling stuff on that. You can subscribe to journals like Pain, Spine, BJSM, British Journal of Sports Medicine. There's several like really good high impact factor journals to follow. And then outside of that, for me, I do like reading about Stoic philosophy, so Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, stuff like that. So you can, their books are like super cheap on Amazon for like $3 to read through that kind of stuff. So I like that stuff. And then that's probably the extent of it for me right now. I fall into this horrible cycle of, I want to be a part of this book club, and we have this book, and I read like a couple chapters, and then I get distracted back by research, and it doesn't go well for me. Yeah.
Okay. Well, for everyone listening, be sure to check out all of Michael's content. Be sure to check out those books that he mentioned. Feel free to check out some research. It's a little difficult to digest, but the more time you spend reading it, the more you begin to kind of understand it and how it's conducted. So don't be afraid. I'm sure it's intimidating, but that's it for this episode of the podcast. If you liked it, feel free to like, share, and subscribe to the show. Share it with your friends, family, and significant other. And I guess we will catch you guys on the next episode. Thanks.